Hello students, welcome to Political Science class. Myself, Mrs. Swati Hazare from Gokhale Education Society's HL High School, English Medium, Ozar Township, Nasik. Today we are going to learn Political Science of Standard 9th from Maharashtra State Board, English Medium Syllabus, Chapter number 4, The United Nations, UN. In the last chapter, we tried to understand the nature of India's defense system. In this chapter, we shall acquaint ourselves with the United Nations, an international organization working for world peace. In the present chapter, we shall study its objectives, principles, structure, and role in securing peace. Background. After the First World War, the League of Nations was established as a mechanism to establish world peace. However, the League of Nations did not succeed. In the Second World War, the use of nuclear weapons was made. In 1945, after the event of World War II, In 1945, after the event of World War II causing irreparable damage to many nations of the world, it was a time where the world wanted peace. Here we can see irreparable damage to many nations of the world. The idea that such destructive wars should be stopped and that it is the collective responsibility of all nations to maintain peace took roots. The United Nations was established to instill this understanding among all nations. In the first half of the 20th century, 2 world wars took place, taking into account the heavy number of deaths of human life and many that the world wars took. All the countries in the world felt the need to take some concrete steps to establish peace. After the World War, the League of Nations had been created to establish peace, but it was not very successful in its objective. The destruction of the Second World War, however, strengthened the idea that such wars must be avoided, and therefore the United Nations, an international organization, was established on 24th October 1945. This day is celebrated as the United Nations Day. The responsibility of maintaining world peace is not with one or two nations alone. Rather, all nations must be aware of this responsibility. The United Nations is an organization which fosters this feeling. The UN Charter is the constitutive instrument of the United Nations, signed on 26th June 1945. It sets out the rights and obligations of member states and establishes the principal organs and procedures of the United Nations. Now, chronology of the establishment of the United Nations. The Atlantic Charter, means treaty, was signed by Sir Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of America, on 14th August 1941. A decision was taken to set up a permanent mechanism to establish international security after the Second World War. In the conferences of the Allied powers in 1944 and 45, a draft treaty to establish an international organization was prepared after detailed discussions. At San Francisco in 1945, representatives of 50 countries drafted the Charter of the United Nations. The United Nations Charter was signed on 24th October 1945 and the United Nations was established. What is the United Nations? The United Nations Organization means UNO is an international organization whose stated aims are facilitating cooperation in international law, international society, economic development, spatial progress, human rights, and the achieving of world peace. And the date of formation at the United Nations UN conference in San Francisco in April 1945, representatives from 51 countries came together and drew up the UN Charter. The Charter was signed by 50 nations on 26th June 1945. United Nations. The United Nations is the world's largest international organization. It is an international organization of all sovereign nations. In the beginning, there were 50 countries. The number has gone up to 193. Here we can see United Nations headquarters in New York City. All the nations that accept the Charter of the United Nations can become its member. This international organization is based on certain important principles. It is an organization of sovereign nations. It is a platform for resolving international issues through peaceful means. All the member nations enjoy an equal status in the organizations. All nations are considered equal without any discrimination on the basis of the extent of development or prosperity. It is binding on all member countries to resolve their international issues only through peaceful means. The objectives of the United Nations. The United Nations has its own definite objectives. Briefly, the United Nations takes up all necessary measures for establishing international peace. To establish friendly relations among nations, to enhance international security by resolving international disputes, to safeguard and foster human rights and freedom, to enhance economic cooperation at the international level. The United Nations coordinates the activities of different countries in order to achieve the above objectives. All member countries are bound by duty to respect the diplomatic privileges of sovereign nations, not to attack other countries, and abide by international law and treaties. The United Nations is an organization created by the coming together of sovereign nations. Naturally, it is based on certain principles, or we can say rules. So, principles of United Nations. All member nations will have the same status. There is no discrimination among nations based on geographical size, economic or military power. All member nations of the United Nations should respect the freedom and geographical unity of other member nations. All member nations should solve their international disputes and disagreements by peaceful means. These are the principles of United Nations. Now come to this point, structure of the United Nations. The United Nations has 6 main organs. The United Nations Charter describes the structure and functioning of the organization. The UN has 6 main organizations. Number 1, the General Assembly. Number 2, the Secretariat. Number 3, Security Council. Then International Court of Justice. Next, Economic and Social Council. And last one, Trusteeship Council. The headquarters of the United Nations are at New York, where the main office of all the organs except the International Court of Justice are also located. Apart from these 6 major organs, there are many affiliated organizations of the United Nations that help it in its functions. They are called specialized agencies working in specific areas. They help different nations in those areas. Some of these important agencies are International Labour Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, World Health Organization, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, United Nations Children's Fund, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organizations, means UNESCO. General Assembly. All the member countries are members of the General Assembly. The position and status of all countries, whether rich or poor, big or small, is the same. The annual session of the General Assembly takes place from September to December. During the session, the General Assembly discusses issues like environment, disarmament, etc. So disarmament means the reduction of the military forces. The decisions are in the form of resolutions and are taken by majority. It is a platform for representatives of member nations to come together and discuss issues of global importance. Here we can see General Assembly. The representatives of all member countries of the United Nations are the members of the General Assembly. Till 2006, the strength of the member countries in the General Assembly was 192. While voting in the General Assembly, every nation has the right to cast only one vote. Srimati Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit was the chairperson of the United Nations General Assembly in 1953. She was the first Indian lady to hold this post. Now, functions of the General Assembly. To elect the non-permanent members of the Security Council, to choose the United Nations Secretary General and the judges of the International Court of Justice (ICJ) in consultation with the Security Council, to pass the annual budget of the United Nations. The General Assembly is the main deliberative. Deliberative means it is related to discussion, policy making and representative organ of the United Nations. Through regular meetings, the General Assembly provides a forum for member states to express their views to the entire membership and find discussion on difficult issues. It makes recommendations in the form of General Assembly resolutions, decisions on important questions such as those on peace and security, admission of new members, and budgetary matters require a 2/3 majority, but other questions are decided by simple majority. Security Council. The UN means United Nations Security Council was established in 1946 under the UN Charter and is responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security. It is one of the 6 principal organs of the UN and is generally viewed as the apex of the United Nations system. There are 15 members in the Security Council. America, Russia, England, France and China are 5 permanent members of the Security Council. 10 are non-permanent members. The non-permanent members are chosen every 2 years the General Assembly. We can see here UN Security Council. The UN Security Council is composed of 5 permanent and 10 non-permanent members. Each year, 5 out of 10 non-permanent UN Security Council members are elected by the UN General Assembly for a 2-year term. The 10 non-permanent seats are distributed on a geographical basis. See, we can see here 5 permanent members. Which are that 5 permanent members? America, Russia, England, France and China. In 1963, the UN General Assembly decided the geographic distribution of the 10 non-permanent members would consist of 3 from the African group, 2 from the Asian groups. These are the 3 African and these are the 2 groups from Asia, 2 from the Latin America and Caribbean group. Here we can see 2 from the Latin America and Caribbean group, 2 from the Western European. We can see here 2 from the Western Europe and other countries, and 1 from the Eastern European group. Here 1 from the Eastern European group. Australia is a member of the Western European and other groups. All decisions require the assent of all 5 permanent members and 4 non-permanent members. Assent means what? To agree. Means all 5 permanent members must be agree on that decision. If even one of the 5 permanent members uses veto, that is negative vote, the decision cannot be taken. Veto means power to reject decision. A negative vote from any of the permanent members will block the adoption of a draft resolution or decision. However, permanent members that refuse to vote or is absent from the vote will not block a resolution or decision from being passed. Now functions. To maintain international peace and security, the Security Council can suggest and resolve conflicts by intervention to establish peace, imposing economic sanctions, military action against the aggressor nation. Number 2, to prepare policies for arms control. To recommend to the General Assembly appointments of the judges of the International Court of Justice and the Secretary General. Here we can see the picture of Security Council. The Security Council takes the lead in determining the existence of a threat to the peace or an act of aggression. It calls upon the parties to a dispute to settle it by peaceful means and recommends methods of adjustment or terms of settlement. The Security Council can take strict measures to maintain or restore international peace and security. Such measures range from economic sanctions to international military action. The Council also establishes UN peacekeeping operations, and special political missions. It is the only body in the UN system that can make decisions that are legally binding on all members. The Council also has an important role in the governance of the UN system. It has responsibility for approving the admission of new member states to the UN, the appointment of the UN Secretary General and senior UN officials, and is jointly responsible with the UN General Assembly for the election of judges to the International Court of Justice. Now come to the next point, United Nations Economic and Social Council. We can see here United Nations Economic and Social Council. The United Nations Economic and Social Council is one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations, responsible for coordinating the economic and social fields of the organization. Specifically, in regards to the 15 specialized agencies, the 8 functional commissions and the 5 regional commissions under its jurisdiction. Jurisdiction means power. Economic and Social Council. The Council consists of 54 members selected the General Assembly for a term of 3 years. Every year, 1/3 of the members are elected. The decisions are taken by majority vote. Its main objective is to coordinate the economic and social activities of the United Nations. We can see here the Council consists of 54 member states which are selected by the General Assembly for a term of 3 years. Seats on the councils are allotted based on geographical representation. So we can see here, with 14 being allocated to the African group, 14 seats being allocated to the African groups. Here we can see all these are the representing African group. 11 to the Asian Pacific group. These are the Asian Pacific group. 6 to the Eastern European group. These are the next 10 to the Latin American and Caribbean group. 13 to the Western European and other group. Now functions of the Economic and Social Council. Initiate discussions at the global level on poverty, unemployment, economic and social inequality and suggest policies to tackle these problems. Discuss and take decisions on empowerment of women, human rights and freedom, global trade, health related issues. Make efforts to establish international culture and educational cooperation. Coordinate the functioning of the affiliated organizations. Under the United Nations Charter, Economic and Social Council is responsible for promoting higher standards of living, full employment and economic and social progress, identifying solutions to international economic, social and health problems, facilitating international culture and educational cooperation, and encouraging universal respect for human rights and fundamental freedom. Come to the next point, Secretariat. The United Nations Secretariat is one of the 6 major organs of the United Nations. The Secretariat is the United Nations executive arm. It has an important role in setting agenda for the deliberative and decision making bodies of the United Nations. And the implementation of the decision of these bodies. Which are that bodies? The General Assembly, Economic and Social Council, and Security Council. The Secretary General, who is appointed by the General Assembly, is the head of the Secretariat. The Secretariat is divided into offices and departments. The Secretariat is the administrative organ of the United Nations. It is headed by the Secretary General. He is elected by the General Assembly on the recommendation of the Security Council for 5 years. Secretariat carries out the substantive work of the United Nations, means separate and independent work of the United Nations as directed by the General Assembly, the Security Council and other organs. Its head, the Secretary General, provides overall administrative guidance. The main functions of the Secretariat are to gather and prepare background information on various issues so that government delegates can study the facts and make recommendations, to help carry out the decisions made by the different organs of the United Nations. Number 3, to organize international conferences, to translate speeches and distribute documents into the UN's official languages, to keep the public informed about the work of the United Nations. Now we will see the functions of the Secretary General are to call international conferences on global problems like climate change, human rights, disarmament, etc. To organize the meetings of the Assembly and Security Council, to compile information, to supply information to the media. Means now we are going to see the functions of the Secretary General. The Secretary General is appointed by the General Assembly on the recommendations of the Secretary Council for a period of 5 years. Advocate, civil servant and CEO, the Secretary General is a symbol of United Nations ideals and a spokesman for the interests of the world's people, in particular the poor, vulnerable, that means unsafe, unprotected people among them. The Secretary General's functions include bringing any problem that threatens world peace to the attention of the Security Council, proposing issues to be discussed by the General Assembly or any other organ of the United Nations, acting as a referee in disputes between member states. The Secretariat comprises the Secretary General and tens of thousands of international UN staff members who carry out the day-to-day work of the UN, means United Nations, as commanded by the General Assembly and the organization's other principal organs. So now we have seen the functions of the Secretary General. So students, today we have learnt about background, chronology of the establishment of the United Nations, objectives and principles of United Nations, as well as 4 main organs of United Nations and their functions. In the next part, we will proceed with International Court of Justice. So students, thanks for watching.